Howdy folks, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. And I really have no idea what I'm going to talk about this week, so I suppose I'll just, well, make it up as I go along. Jingles, that's what you do every week. Shh, don't tell them. They all think I'm a professional. Right, yeah, anyway. Well, I suppose the big news is that I've been invited to go to the World of Warships Community Contributor Summit. Which is in St. Petersburg. I'm going to Russia, which is going to be amazing. I mean, St. Petersburg. It's where the Russian capital used to be before they moved it to Moscow. It's an amazing city. Also, I think it's Tier 3, possibly Tier 4. No, I'm pretty sure it's Tier 3. The Aurora, Russian premium cruiser in World of Warships. Modelled on the real thing, which is in St. Petersburg. Although it was in restoration, I suppose is the right word, a couple of years ago. For quite some time, they basically had to rebuild the entire thing from the waterline down because it had just rusted away to nothing. But it's back. As of, I think, last year, the restoration's complete, and it's there on the river once again. So I don't know how much actual free time I'm going to have at this thing. I think it takes place over 2 days, but I'm going to kick myself if I go to some place like St. Petersburg and I don't see the Winter Palace or the Hermitage or the Aurora, you know, things like that. It wouldn't surprise me if they were going to take us and show us the Aurora, because, you know, it's World of Warships and the Aurora's right there, but fingers crossed, you never know. And I suppose I should probably, you know, ask them questions about World of Warships and stuff like that while I'm there as well. Actually, that's not a bad idea. There we go. Suggestions down below in the comments. I'm not entirely sure whether or not... I mean, I haven't received an agenda for this summit or anything yet. But I can't imagine that we won't have the opportunity to ask them questions. Although we can ask them questions anytime we want, because we've got the World of Warships community Discord with a developer Q&A channel in there. But if you have any questions that you'd like me to take along to ask, assuming I get the opportunity, and I'm pretty sure I will, then yeah, there we go. Let's see your questions down below in the comments of this video, and I'll make a note of the ones that seem to get the most votes. And that's not an excuse for you to all start trolling. Okay. I know what you like. Okay, right. Serious questions only. You can see it right now. I promised to take the most upvoted question to the community summit in St. Petersburg, and the number one upvoted question is, Jingles, why are you such a noob? So yeah, serious questions only. Actually, I can answer that one for you right now. I'm a massive noob, so you lot don't have to be. That's the whole point of the channel. Anyway, speaking of the Aurora and other Russian ships that were in a really, really shit state and had to be fixed, I found out something quite, well, interesting and amusing. A little nugget of historical information. While I was looking for a suitable name for a Soviet battleship in World of Warships, last week I posted a spoof picture on Facebook with the proposed Soviet Tier 10 battleship, and it was basically a picture of a Star Wars Imperial Star Destroyer floating over an ocean. Everybody had a good laugh, everybody thought it was quite funny. Some people actually seriously asked where the news had been leaked about the Soviet battleships. No, really. But while I was looking at the article on Wikipedia that listed all of the Soviet and Russian battleships that had ever been built, I noticed, well, a couple of curious things about Soviet battleships, and we'll come on to that after I get onto the main point of the story here. While I was looking at this list, I noticed a couple of foreign-built ships that were used in the Russian Navy. One of them was named the Archangels, and the other one was named this is a bit of a mouthful, there's far too many S's in it. Novorossiysk? Yes, there we go. That's a pretty good try, instead of just calling it the Battleship Dave. The Novorossiysk. The Novorossiysk used to be the Italian Tier 5 premium battleship in World of Warships, the Giulio Cesare, or, you know, Julius Caesar for those of us who speak English. I thought to myself, how the hell did that end up in the Soviet Navy? Well, it was taken as war reparations from the Italians but it was only transferred in 1948. Oh, hang on a minute. World War II ended in 1945. Why did it take 3 years for Russia to claim war reparations from Italy? And why is Russia claiming war reparations from Italy in the first place? What did the Italians ever do to the Russians? I mean, in fact, the Italians were on the Russian side 2 years after Germany invaded Russia. Italy swapped sides in 1943. So why are the Russians claiming war reparations from their allies, of all people? But then I remembered, actually, there were Italian troops at Stalingrad. There were Romanian and Hungarian troops at Stalingrad as well. It wasn't just the Germans. So, yeah, that probably had something to do with it. But at the same time, I mean, that was 1943. The war ended in 1945, and the Julius Caesar wasn't handed over to Russia until 1948. So what happened in that 3-year gap? Well, it turned out that in 1944, the Royal Navy transferred the Revenge-class battleship HMS Royal Sovereign to the Russian Northern Fleet in 1944 in lieu of reparations from Italy. I don't know why the Royal Navy felt responsible for Italian war reparations, but that's the reason why the Julius Caesar didn't get transferred until 4 years later in 1948. So not only the Julius Caesar, but also the Royal Sovereign were two foreign battleships in Russian service. But something about the dates involved still didn't quite match up. The Julius Caesar was handed over to the Russians in 1948, but the Royal Navy didn't get HMS Royal Sovereign back until 1949. So what's going on there? Well, it turned out the Russians just didn't want to give it back. They quite liked it, so they started making up excuses. First they claimed that she wasn't seaworthy enough to be transferred back, but an inspection by a Royal Naval officer proved that they were talking out of their arseholes. They were just making shit up so they wouldn't have to give the ship back. So the Royal Navy said, bollocks to you, you dirty cheating commie bastards, give us our ship back, it's our property. So the Russians reluctantly agreed to let us have the ship back, although it could have been that they were too embarrassed to let us have the ship back because of the terrible state that they'd allowed it to fall into. I mean, there's a difference between a seaworthy ship and an operational ship. I mean, she was seaworthy, only just, but she was far from operational. In the 5 years that the Russians had had this battleship, they had never once rotated the main gun turrets. And if you don't rotate the main gun turrets on a battleship every now and then, guess what happens to them? They rust up. And that's exactly what had happened. After 5 years of just pointing straight forward and aft, they'd seized up solid into those positions. And that wasn't the only thing that was wrong with the ship. Most of the equipment on the ship was just completely unserviceable. It had never been maintained in 5 years. So we got it back, but then we just had to scrap it because it was completely useless. It was in such poor condition you couldn't have even used it as a barracks ship. I mean, it was unlivable. So yeah, thanks Russia. But anyway, while looking at this list of Russian battleships and Soviet battleships, bearing in mind that at some point we're going to get Russian battleships in World of Warships, hence the whole spoof with the Star Destroyer that I posted on Facebook the other week, something fairly important struck me when I'm looking at this list. It's not that the Russians didn't have any battleships. They did. They had a lot of battleships. Most of them were pretty terrible. Some of them were pretty good. But they kind of stopped building them after 1916. And they never started building any until 1938 with the Sovietsky Soyuz class battleships, which, if they'd ever gotten around to finishing them, would have been as big as the Yamato, although they wouldn't have had the same firepower. They were going to be armed with 16-inch guns rather than the Yamato's 18-inch guns. But they did start building these things, 4 of them, between 1938 and 1939, and then about halfway through construction, the Germans knocked on the front door, and Stalin probably very wisely decided that all of that steel could far better be used building tanks instead, which was probably a very, very good decision. So they were all scrapped and never built. Now, just because something was scrapped and was never built doesn't mean we're not going to see it in World of Warships. And the Sovietsky Soyuz could, in fact, be the Soviet Tier 10 battleship. But what are we going to have at Tier 9, 8, 7? and potentially 6. Because if you look at the Russian battleships that were actually built, I mean, there's a case to be argued for taking dreadnoughts and then giving them midlife upgrades, because that's what happened with the Nagato, for example, and that's a Tier 7 battleship in World of Warships. It was actually commissioned in 1920, but received a midlife, well, several midlife upgrades, and was quite a formidable battleship in World War II. And there are some Soviet dreadnoughts, the Gangut class, for example, that were built between 1908 and 1914, that were still in service by 1956, but in service doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. Not a lot is known about what happened to them after World War II, but they were classified as school battleships, which probably means they were being used as training ships, so they were never upgraded. They never got the same kind of modifications that, for example, the British did with the Warspite, the Americans did with the Colorado and the New Mexico, and the Japanese did with the Nagato and the Fuso. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't, for example, say, well, okay, we know that these are pre-First World War dreadnoughts, but we can apply an imaginary what-if between the war upgrade modification package to them, give them better boilers and more anti-aircraft guns and call them Tier 6 battleships. But then you've still got to find something for Tier 7, 8 and 9. And you're basically just going to have to make shit up. Because there is nothing else. So, yeah, I mean, and again, this is something that they have done before. The British battleships, for example. The Conqueror, the Lion, the Monarch. They never actually existed. The last British battleship in World of Warships that actually existed was King George V at Tier 7. And the Nelson also at Tier 7. The Tier 8, 9 and 10 are proposed blueprints. Maybe we might get around to building them one day type designs. So you could probably do that with the Russian battleships as well, but you'd very probably have to stretch it down as far as Tier 7 and possibly even Tier 6 as well. It's going to be interesting whatever they come up with. That might be a question worth asking at the Community Contributor Summit in St. Petersburg, actually. I must remember to write that one down. Wargaming question. Just exactly how far up your arse are you going to have to reach in order to pull out designs for the Soviet Tier 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10 battleships? Maybe I should phrase it slightly differently. I don't want them to toss me out after the first day. But then again, this is not something that they haven't done before. Just look at the Chinese tank destroyers in World of Tanks. There's only one of them that ever actually existed. It was a Russian design. The rest of them, they just made up. It's the same with the Soviet artillery. Once you get past the S-51 at... Oh, well, that's Tier 7 now. It used to be Tier 5, it's Tier 7 now. But once you get past that, none of them existed. They just make them up as they go along. And nobody ever complained about that. Well, beyond the standard artillery complaints. But yeah, if they can get away with it in World of Tanks, there's no reason why they can't get away with it in World of Warships as well. But it's probably still worth asking the question, if for no better reason than I want to see them squirm. I want to see how uncomfortable they look when I ask them where they're going to get the Soviet battleships from. So yeah, I must remember to write that one down. Oh, actually, I've just remembered there is something that I wanted to talk about in this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Actually, if I'm being completely honest, it's something that I wanted to talk about in last week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, but being old and crap, I forgot. So, well, this is all to do with a message that I received about 2 weeks ago. And it's a message that prompted me to do a bit of research, because it's to do with a subject that I found both surprising and fascinating. It's basically about the Chinese involvement in the Vietnam War. You might be thinking, well, there's nothing surprising about that. Obviously, communist China supported communist North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh. And yeah, anybody who knows anything about the Vietnam War is aware that it was the communist North against the USA who was supporting the nominally democratic South Vietnam. Anybody who knows a little bit more about the Vietnam War knows that they weren't the only nations involved, as well as Russian support for North Vietnam. Australia sent several thousand troops over there as well. Korea sent never more than 50,000 at one time, and I'm talking South Korea here. but a total of over 300,000 South Korean troops at one time or another were fighting in Vietnam as well. All kinds of other nations were involved. New Zealand sent some troops, including a detachment of the New Zealand Special Air Service. The Philippines sent over 10,000 troops, although they were limited to medical and logistics support operations. They didn't send any combat troops. Thailand sent a small detachment of troops. It was known as the Cobra Battalion, but they also committed to monitoring North Vietnamese operations along the portions of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that actually ran through Laos. Canada wasn't officially directly involved, but Canadian industry supplied the USA with more than $2.5 billion of war material during the 1960s and 70s. They didn't just give America $2.5 billion worth of war materials, of course. They're Canadian, they're not stupid. But Canadian factories were making everything from US Army and Air Force uniforms to Agent Orange chemical defoliants. And while the Canadian government might not have been directly involved in the war, that doesn't mean Canadian citizens weren't. More than 30,000 of them volunteered to fight. Which seems like a fair trade, because at least 30,000 Americans ran away to Canada so they wouldn't have to fight. Probably ended up working jobs in the Canadian defence industry. But some of those Canadians who volunteered to fight really didn't like they meant it. Let me read you a medal citation for one of those Canadians. This was Sergeant Peter C. Lemon, who at the time was a specialist 4th class from Company E, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, 1st Cavalry Division. Distinguished himself on April 1st, 1970 while serving as an assistant machine gunner during the defence of Fire Support Base Illingworth in Tay Ninh Province, Republic of Vietnam. When the base came under heavy enemy attack, Sergeant Lemon engaged a numerically superior enemy with machine gun and rifle fire from his defensive position until both weapons malfunctioned. He was probably using an M16. He then used hand grenades to fend off the intensified enemy attack launched in his direction. After eliminating all but one of the enemy soldiers in the immediate vicinity, he pursued and disposed of the remaining soldier in hand-to-hand combat. I love the really casual, matter-of-fact way they say that. He basically got mad, went after this guy and beat him to death with his fists. Despite fragmentation wounds from an exploding grenade, so he's already been wounded once, Sergeant Lemon regained his position, carried a more seriously wounded comrade to an aid station, and as he returned was wounded a second time by enemy rifle fire. Disregarding his personal injuries, he moved to his position through a hail of small arms and grenade fire. Sergeant Lemon immediately realised that the defensive sector was in danger of being overrun by the enemy, and unhesitatingly assaulted the enemy soldiers by throwing hand grenades and, again, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. This guy really loved a fist fight. He was wounded a third time, but his determined efforts successfully drove the enemy from the position. Securing an operable machine gun, Sergeant Lemon stood on top of an embankment fully exposed to enemy fire and placed effective fire upon the enemy until he collapsed from his multiple wounds and exhaustion. So basically, after being grenaded, shot twice, beating multiple North Vietnamese army to death with his bare hands, his body finally persuaded him to take a bit of a break and he just collapsed on the spot. After regaining consciousness at the aid station, he refused medical evac until his more seriously wounded comrades had been evacuated. Sergeant Lemon's conspicuous gallantry and extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit on him, his unit, and the United States Army. That's his citation for the Congressional Medal of Honor. And he's not even American. I mean, it's US Army, but he's a Canadian citizen. And he's still alive today, 67 years old. Currently lives in Toronto, in Canada. And he wasn't just awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Unsurprisingly, he also earned a Purple Heart, or as they like to call it, the Viet Cong Marksmanship Medal, a Bronze Star, the Air Medal, and the Army Commendation Medal. Peter C. Lemon. So, yeah, Canada. I was going to say not directly involved. Peter C. Lemon would argue differently, but not officially directly involved in the Vietnam War. Then, of course, there were the supporters of communist North Vietnam. So, Russia, obviously, supplied a lot of military equipment, as well as a troop commitment that had as many as 3,000 troops at its best. And more than 2,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 5,000 anti-aircraft guns, and nearly 200 surface-to-air missile batteries. At one point, Russia was supplying Hanoi with $2 million of aid every day. And in at least one incident, Soviet advisors actually engaged American forces in combat. During an air raid on the north in 1965, I think this was part of Operation Rolling Thunder, Soviet anti-aircraft gunners fired on and destroyed American F-4 Phantoms near Hanoi. Now, the Americans weren't stupid. They knew that the air defense batteries around Hanoi were crewed by Russian volunteers. You know, like the German Condor Legion volunteered to fight for the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. Yeah. Which was the reason why they weren't allowed to actually defend themselves. They weren't allowed to do suppression of air defense missions around Hanoi because they couldn't kill Russians, because politics. Although the Russians had no compunctions about, returning the favour, because they refused to admit they were there. But everybody knew the Americans were there, so the Americans couldn't deny. That's something that's always bothered me about the Vietnam War, by the way. I mean, there's all kinds of things that should bother you about the Vietnam War. But in particular, that's always struck me as the stupidest thing ever. American air crews were not allowed to suppress the air defences around Hanoi, and yet were ordered in to bomb Hanoi without taking out the air defences first. And the reason they weren't allowed to suppress the air defences was because the American government didn't want to risk killing any Russians. But the Russians were denying they were there in the first place. What was the worst possible thing that was going to happen? The Russians were going to stand up in the United Nations and say, America has committed an act of war against us. They have killed Russian soldiers in North Vietnam. That was America's big fear, because that might provoke World War III. But all America had to do at that point is say, what Russian soldiers in North Vietnam? Oh, so you're admitting that you put soldiers in North Vietnam to shoot down American aircraft? At which point the Soviet ambassador would say, I withdraw my objection. So, it just, I don't know, politics. It takes a smarter man than me to understand. Anyway, getting off the point here. So, the Soviet Union, surprise, surprise, supported communist North Vietnam, as did Cuba, although it's never actually admitted to it. But several thousand military engineers allegedly aided the communist war effort. North Korea, 2 squadrons of MiG-17s and a squadron of MiG-21s, 30 planes in all. More than 200 North Korean pilots eventually rotated in and out of Vietnam during the war and flew many combat missions against the USA. 2 full regiments of air defense troops were also dispatched. And then we come to China. And this is where things get complicated for more than one reason. Beginning in 1965, the People's Republic of China sent military engineers and anti-aircraft batteries to North Vietnam. They supplied millions of dollars in rice and more than 90,000 assault rifles to the North Vietnamese army. But by 1968, China began to withdraw its support because they were getting a bit pissed off with Russia. And I could probably talk for hours about the split between communist China and communist Russia, but that's a topic for another day. Anyway, China gradually shifted its support to the communist Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Oh, there was a nice bunch of people. Pol Pot murdered something like 2 million of his own people, right up there with Hitler and Stalin, supported by China. Nice. Anyway, following the victory over South Vietnam in 1975, the unified Vietnam then waged a 4-year war against Cambodia, who was being supported by China. To retaliate for this, China invaded Vietnam in 1979. So, yeah, just think about this one for a minute. After spending around 10 years fighting and winning a war against one global superpower, the USA, 4 years later, the Vietnamese were then invaded by another global superpower, the People's Republic of China, and beat them. Thus giving rise to the third rule of land warfare. The first being never invade Russia, especially not in the winter. The second being if you're Russians, don't fuck around with the Finns, and the third being, if you're anybody else, don't fuck around with the Vietnamese. But I said that the Chinese involvement in the Vietnam War was complicated for more than one reason, and so far you've only heard one reason. The other reason, well, it depends on... If I was to say to you, how many Chinas are there? What would your answer be? Now, if you're in the People's Republic of China, what everybody thinks of as China, Communist China, the answer would be there's only one China. But if you live in Taiwan, your answer might be slightly different, at least unofficially. All of which brings me back, eventually, I will eventually get to the point, to the message that I received about 2 weeks ago from Rebo, who is, funnily enough, Canadian. He was born in Toronto, same place as Sergeant Peter Lemon, Canadian winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor. But his father was born in Taipei, in Taiwan, in 1947. And not a lot of people realise that while Communist China, the People's Republic of China, was sending millions of dollars worth of aid and weapons and troops into North Vietnam to fight the USA and the South. But on the other side of the fence, the Republic of China, or Taiwan, which was fiercely anti-communist, for reasons we will go into in a moment, was doing the same thing, but very, very quietly. You see, prior to World War II, the Chinese were having a very nasty little civil war between the communists under Mao Zedong on one side and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek on the other side. And then the Japanese interrupted, which was very, very rude of them, and then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the Americans thought, right, we're not standing for this. Oh crap, you've sunk most of our Pacific fleet. Okay, well, while we rebuild the fleet, we're going to support the Chinese nationalists against the Japanese. And so General Vinegar Joe Stilwell was sent to China, and billions of dollars of military aid was supplied to the Chinese nationalists. And so Chiang Kai-shek said, thanks very much for all the money and the weapons, and what he didn't stick in his own pockets. America really does seem to have a history of backing the losers, don't they? Anyway. What he didn't stick in his own pockets, he squirreled away until after the Japanese had been defeated, so he could use all of that military aid to fight the communists and start the Civil War up again, which didn't work out too well for him because they lost. Although technically didn't. Technically the Chinese Civil War never ended because the nationalists retreated all the way south, out of mainland China, to Formosa, the country or territory now known as Taiwan. The war never officially ended, but they just kind of realised that they were going to lose, so they stopped fighting. And America still supported the Chinese nationalists militarily. So China, which had just suffered unbelievable losses at the hands of the Japanese, second only to the Russians at the hands of the Germans during World War II, and then coming fresh out of a horrible civil war, just thought, you know what, fine. We could invade you, but we're not going to, okay? But we're not admitting that you're independent. There is only one China. And the nationalists said, yeah, okay, we can kind of live by those terms. So you've got two Chinas, if not officially, then, you know, to all practical intents and purposes. One of those Chinas was involved in a very complicated relationship with North Vietnam, first supporting them and then not liking them very much because they didn't like their Russian allies, and then invading them and getting their arse handed to them. Third rule of land warfare, remember, don't mess around with the Vietnamese. And the other China, Taiwan, was also involved in the Vietnam War, but not on the side of the communists. Taiwan provided transport aircraft and very, very secretly offered several hundred of its Special Forces soldiers to the South Vietnamese cause, beginning in 1961. Rebo's dad, remember Rebo, born in Toronto, Canada, but his father was born in Taiwan in 1947. Rebo's dad, at the time, was in the Taiwanese army, and he was a paratrooper and a first sergeant, and he was on the list to be shipped to Vietnam. And this was at the time when Communist China was supporting North Vietnam. The idea was that these guys were going to be trained to be parachuted in to North Vietnam. No mention was made of how they were going to get out again. They were going to be dropped behind enemy lines to act as commandos. And Rebo's dad was on this list. 25 Taiwanese soldiers were killed, that we know of, in action in Vietnam. Nobody really knows how many more were captured, but can you imagine what would happen to a Taiwanese Chinese soldier found operating behind North Vietnamese lines at the time when China, Communist China, was actively engaged in supporting North Vietnam? Unsurprisingly, Rebo's dad decided, fuck that, resigned from the military and moved to Canada. All of which brings us to the fourth and final rule of land warfare. If it doesn't seem like a good idea, just burn your draft ticket and move to Canada. It worked for tens of thousands of Americans, and it worked for Rebo's dad too. It's probably the smartest decision he ever made. All of which brings us to the end of this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, which I don't think is too bad considering we're approaching the 32-minute mark, and roughly 32 minutes ago I didn't have a clue what I was going to talk about. You see, I'm a professional bullshitter. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mingles with Jingles, which of course is always advert free, thanks to everybody who supports me on Patreon. And as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.